In October of 2022, a 12-year-old girl walked into her apartment building, but somehow she never made it home. This case is a complete criminological anomaly. It diverges sharply from our established crime statistics and completely sits outside our conventional understanding of violent crimes and sexual homicide and stranger abduction. And what's even more is that this case is an outlier when it comes to women on women crime. Rarely do we encounter a crime in which the conscience of an entire nation is rattled by the victimization of a single person. This is the story of Lola Daviet. Hi, welcome to Collectively Vigilant. I'm Dr. D. If you're new here, well, welcome. Here at Collectively Vigilant, we learn the law through true crime. So if that sounds good to you, please consider subscribing to this channel. And if you stick around in this entire episode, not only will you hear a story, you'll also understand how French criminal justice system works. You will also understand how the jury system works in France, which is really fascinating because they have 3 judges along with 6 citizen jurors, and how that jury is selected and how French privacy laws limit our understanding of what really goes on in a case, but at the same time tries to give dignity to a victim. Okay, so with that being said, I should also tell you that we are available on Spotify, on YouTube Music, on Apple, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Right, so now let's start with the story of Lola Daviet. October 14 of 2022 was an ordinary Friday. Lola Daviet got up bright and early to go to school. She got ready as she usually did. It was a Friday, so not only was it the last day of school and the last day of gymnastics training, it was also the last day before she would be able to leave Paris and go to a small retreat with her family to a cottage in the rural countryside of where her family stayed on some weekends. As a national level gymnast, Lola was a very dedicated middle school student. Lola was completely looking forward to spending all this time outdoors with her brother Tibu. With those thoughts firmly at the back of her mind, 12-year-old Lola left her home at 7 a.m. in the morning, and that morning the temperature was around 15 or 16 degrees Celsius. She kissed her father Joan and then said goodbye to her mother Delphine. Delphine, on her part, attempted to persuade Lola to eat something before she left the house. The family lived in the 19th arrondissement of Paris, which is far removed from the postcard image of the city. This is not the Haussmann Boulevard. This is not a place with cafe terraces overlooking the river. This is a very dense working class district shaped by waves of immigration and post-war social housing. This 19th arrondissement of Paris is anchored by large residential complexes and community infrastructure. It reflects the lived reality of an everyday Parisian rather than the curated, aesthetic, touristy sort of side of the Eiffel Tower or Saint-Germain. It is a neighborhood where cultures intersect. It is the 19th arrondissement is the place where you can see true economic precarity and resilience. So it's in this place where we find Lola, who's walking to school with her friends. And there is no deviation from her routine. It's a normal day. She attended classes, she ate lunch, she walked home that afternoon. Her parents were waiting for her at home. Both Joan and Delphine were caretakers of the building where the family lived. And Lola always walked home chatting with her friends who lived in the nearby areas. It was approximately 3:20 p.m. and after some lingering, Lola enters her building at 3:25 p.m. However, 3:30 came and went, and then 3:45 came and went, and then 4 p.m. came and went, and then it was 4:15. By the time it was nearly 4:30, Joan, the father, could no longer tell himself that Lola was simply talking to a friend or lingering somewhere, maybe in a playground. Lola was the kind of person who was punctual to a fault. She was a national level gymnast, remember? So why would she suddenly be late on this particular day? By 3:45 p.m., Johan had called his wife Delphine and relayed the entire situation to her. He rushed to review the building's CCTV footage while simultaneously Lola's mom had started contacting the police, and basically she's even started posting on her social media accounts if anybody had seen Lola. While Delphine was doing that, Joanne saw a familiar face on the CCTV screen. He saw his daughter Lola entering the building at 3:25 p.m. as expected, and as she walked in, so did a beautiful woman with dark brunette hair, a woman with very slight build, and the two of them in the CCTV footage seemed to be talking to each other. Now remember, this building is a secure social housing complex, so you require entry credentials to even walk into the building. And remember, Lola's parents served as building supervisors, so they had this early access to CCTV footage that parents or people usually have in any kind of case. So when Joanne saw that Lola did not take the elevator to the actual family floor, he became really scared. When Lola entered the sixth floor apartment, the ordinary world outside ended and a private horror truly began. Private not in the literal sense of being behind a closed door, but private in the legal sense as well, because everything that I'll tell you from now on is basically shrouded in under privacy law. There are some things which have been disclosed and some which we'll never know. What we do know is from the outside, what we do know is that the parents could see that Lola had taken the elevator up to a certain floor, but what the parents and the police couldn't see at this time is in which particular apartment did Lola enter. Plus, the family began searching for Lola along with the police. Now, at approximately 5:30 or 6 p.m. on the same day, again the parents could see that this brunette woman who had already been talking to Lola around 3:30 p.m. exits the building with a large suitcase in tow. They also see, the police later sees this woman going from one CCTV camera to the other, walking on the street, and she is carrying this suitcase with her. She even stops at a cafe and she leaves that suitcase outside on the street. She goes in, gets herself a coffee and a pain au chocolat, and then tries to even recruit men to help her carry her bags, that big suitcase as well. She's very chatty. Eventually, she ends up making a phone call to someone who helps her carry this large suitcase into the boot of a car, and then that car is seen leaving the neighborhood. On the same road, Lola's family is walking around looking for their child, a child who was no longer alive. But they didn't know that yet. Later in the same evening, the suitcase is discovered and Lola is found concealed within that suitcase. Now I'm going to pivot and tell you details of what happened inside the apartment, and especially inside that 6th floor apartment in particular. Now, court reporting and investigative summaries indicate that Lola was taken inside this apartment by a woman by the name of Dabia bin Kerad. She was forced into the bathroom where she was made to shower. As Lola stepped out, she was sexually assaulted and compelled into oral acts against her own will. Some newspapers report that the perpetrator, Dabia bin Kerad, climaxed, and after she climaxed, the violence escalated against Lola Daviet. She then strangled Lola Daviet at some point. The exact sequence of these things is not publicly available, and this is consistent with French criminal procedure, which restricts disclosure of granular evidence, granular material, especially those involving minors. When the court formally established these things a year or two later, it became indisputable fact. However, what the newspapers seem to tell us here and there is that at some point Lola was bound with tapes. Her face was taped. She sustained multiple stab wounds according to one newspaper. Another website said that she had died because of asphyxiation. Some newspaper outlets have reported that the number 0 and the number 1 was marked on the soles of her feet, but I'm not super sure about this fact, whether it's a fact or not. These findings, some of them were judicially acknowledged later on when the trial began, but some of them are still disputed. What remains undisclosed is the precise minute-by-minute progression of the violence against Lola. However, This limitation is imposed by French law. Okay, privacy is very important in French law. So, as a storyteller, this means that I have to acknowledge two truths in front of you. At once, I have to acknowledge that there's this brutality which was done against Lola, which is real, and it has been legally proven. However, I must also acknowledge that there are narrative gaps which will be structural. I'm not trying to be evasive. This is just in keeping with French law. The horror that was done to this child does not diminish just because we don't know the choreography of this whole event, which from one second to the other. If anything, I would say that the restraint of disclosure underscores the gravity of what was done to this child. Now let's try to understand the French legal system a little bit, okay? In France, the most serious criminal cases, including murder, are heard by what's called the court assize, a term derived from Old French meaning a court of sitting. It is a criminal court reserved for major felonies, and the jurors inside this legal system are not taken from the driving license database, as is very common in parts of the US, but jurors are actually taken out of the electoral polls from registered voters. Each year, as a trial comes up, names are selected randomly from the electoral rolls, and then eligible citizens are summoned for service under French law. All these have to be French nationals, they have to be 18 and above, they must know French, and if all these are fulfilled, then people are called for jury duty. This kind of system, the French system, relies on random civic participation rather than demographic engineering, which we see so often in American style jury, where they try to get people from different races, because America, as we know, is a melting pot, right? So unlike that, in the French system, it's registered citizens who are casting a vote in the electoral theatre of France. So the court assize is composed of 3 professional judges and 6 lay people. And in total, these are 9 people who make a decision when it comes to a particular felony which is in front of the court. All these 9 people sit together and they deliberate together within the same room, which are 3 professional judges and 6 normal people. There is no separate jury verdict or a special judicial verdict by the judges. To convict someone, at least 6 people should agree with each other. And to convict, at least 6 out of 9 should always be voting in favor of guilt. This is the threshold that has to be reached. Unless this is the threshold which is reached every time, the accused will be acquitted. Sentencing is also decided communally by these 9 people, which is 3 judges and 6 lay people. And the judges do guide the 6 average people about the legal framework and how the procedure should be rigorously done. However, numerically, remember, unless 6 of them agree, whatever the verdict is, cannot go ahead. So this is a hybrid structure which reflects the it basically reflects a philosophical distinction between the common law kind of law that you and I are familiar with, because in America, in India, in Kenya, in South Africa, in Canada, in Australia, in England, the jury system works in a very different way, right? So here, let's say in the United States and the UK, juries typically deliberate all alone and they reach a unanimous decision, and the judges simply basically are just confined to questions of law in most jury trials, okay? However, in France, the legal expertise and professional expertise lies with the judges, but the entire deliberative body is all these 9 people put together, 6 normal people, and then 3 judges. So this is not a purely judge only or a jury only system. It's basically a mixture or a blend of everything. So now I'll take you back to, now that we've understood a little bit about the legal system of France, I'll now take you back to the fateful day when Lola was discovered. So as I said, Lola disappeared on October 14 of 2022, and she was actually discovered late in the night of October 14 of 2022, within a few hours. By the dawn of October 15 of 2022, less than 24 hours after Lola walked into her building but never made it home, the perpetrator, Dabia bin Karat, was taken into police custody. That's when the case shifted instantly from a missing child investigation to a matter of French criminal justice system. Under French procedure, a suspect in a serious felony, such as a murder, must be placed within police custody, initially just for 48 hours, but it keeps extending according to the gravity of the evidence that they find. During this phase, the investigators question the suspect under judicial supervision, so there's actually a magistrate there. And this is very important to the French system, which is the inquisitorial system. It's the same in civil law nations. Unlike the Anglo-American, the UK-American system, the prosecutors largely do a direct investigation. In French law, unlike Anglo-American systems where prosecutors largely direct the entire investigation, it doesn't work like that in French law, which places formal oversight on the hands of the magistrate, who is like a judge. The magistrate gathers all the evidence, both incriminating evidence and also exculpatory evidence. So, shortly after the arrest of Dabia bin Karad in October of 2022, she was, as I said, placed under investigation for the murder of a person who's under the age of 15, which is the age of a minor in France. She was charged with aggravated sexual assault. She was charged with torture. She was charged with barbarity. She was placed in detention and pre-trial detention pending a trial. So under French law, before a trial, psychiatric investigation is done, psychiatric examination is done as a mandatory part of the trial. Under French law, Article 122(1), the French Penal Code clearly says that a person is not criminally responsible at the time of an act if there's a psychological disorder and their discernment was not in their own control. So, if their discernment is altered in any way, then that will become a mitigating factor later. In this case of Lola Daviet and Dabia bin Karad, the court appointed an expert to look into the mental health of Dabia bin Karad. So, and that psychologist who was appointed by the court came to the conclusion that Dabia knew what she was doing. She understood what she was doing, and she knew what she had done was wrong. This finding meant that the court will now be able to take Dabia to trial. And that's what happens in serious felonies. So the trial against Dabia bin Karad opened 1 year after the killing of Lola. Lola was killed on October 14 of 2022, and the case went to trial in October of 2023 before the court in Paris, which is the court Assize. The case in court lasted approximately 6 days, and inside the courtroom there were 3 professional judges along with 6 citizen jurors. All 9 of them deliberated together, and all 9 of them, their votes have equal weight. In the court, the prosecution provided graphic forensic evidence against Dabia bin Karad. They showed surveillance footage of her entering the apartment and then exiting with a suitcase. Experts were called and they testified. The prosecution argued that the crime was intentional and it was sustained, and the torture was unnecessary and sustained. It was accompanied by sexual violence and deliberate concealment of Lola's body. The defense did not successfully establish that she was irresponsible because of her psychiatric vulnerability, although they tried. They did say that Dabia has had trauma in the past. She was assaulted herself as a child. Her parents had died. Both her parents had passed away. She was living basically between different friends' couches. She was couch surfing. She was housing insecure. These kind of things were the kind of things that Dabia bin Karad's defense attorney tried to put into the trial. It was heard. However, that does not take away from the responsibility that she had in this crime, and she could discern right from wrong. Outside the courtroom, the case had already ignited a lot of political reaction. This is where we need to go into a little bit of Algerian history. Now, Dabia was an Algerian national who had previously been told and given a particular piece of paper, which basically at an airport, and she had been asked to leave the country. That piece of paper is called an obligation to leave the French territory. Okay, it's an administrative expulsion of a person from the territory of France. Okay, however, even after getting that piece of paper, Dabia bin Karar did not leave the country. She was very much in there, and it was her sister's apartment on the sixth floor where she had been basically not even renting. She was just crashing on the sister's couch when she did this particular crime. So, as you can imagine, this is an illegal immigrant, and right wing political figures, particularly from a party which is known, which has a French name but basically translates into the National Rally Party, seized upon the fact that Dabia bin Karar is an illegal immigrant who was asked to leave, and they basically tried to highlight the systematic failure of immigration enforcement in this case. For others, this case became a symbol of bureaucratic negligence, and for some, it became everything about what's wrong with immigration in France. Okay, so this is of course different from the legal matter, but we must understand politically what's going on in the country because of the case of Lola Daviet, because it became such an important political maelstrom. One can argue that enforcement of existing legal orders collapsed in this particular case. However, not every single immigrant is a terrible person. So it should not, or not all immigrants should be collectively blamed. But definitely this woman was absolutely nuts, and she should have been made to leave the country. But as you and I both know, nuance is desperately missing when it comes to immigration. However, especially when it comes to France, it has even more of a backdrop when it comes to Algeria. The historical backdrop here is that France colonized Algeria in 1830, and they held on to the country for about 122 years. So Algerian War of Independence ended in 1962, after which Algeria became an independent country. But before that, Algeria was under France. The relationship between these two nations has remained politically and culturally changed for decades. Immigration from North Africa is deeply woven into the social fabric of modern France. Millions of immigrants from these places, live peacefully. They're law-abiding citizens. Yet when it comes to the crime of this magnitude, especially when it's done by a non-citizen, who was subject to expulsion, who was explicitly told to leave the country, of course this becomes more of a political maelstrom. While a courtroom can adjudicate a person on their guilt, the public sphere debates about this in terms of that person's identity. So that's why these kind of cases become so important in political memory and in what shapes a culture together. So all this was definitely happening outside the courtroom. What was happening inside the courtroom was these 9 people, 3 of whom are judges who are appointed by law, and 6 lay jurors. Basically, the 9 of them were trying to weigh the evidence to prove whether Dabia bin Karar was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt under French law. After deliberation, the 9 of them returned a verdict of guilty against Dabia bin Karar. Bin Karar was in fact sentenced to something which is almost unheard of. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, which basically means that for 30 years of absolute scrutiny, she's not even eligible for parole. For 30 years, she will be there for sure. And under French law, such a sentence is sometimes basically called perpetual incarceration. Although, 30 years is nothing, but because in France, imprisonment is seen as a way to rehabilitate someone rather than to just punish someone. That's why this distinction is really important, that under French law, this is very severe penalty. However, it's not a death sentence because France abolished capital punishment in the year 1981. So what this ensures, this perpetual relay, basically, as it's called. What it ensures is, if Dabia bin Karad is ever granted parole, it will be under extremely stringent judicial review. It will take decades, because she will be there for 30 years, and it also means that she will be deported if she ever gets out. Okay. Now, as this verdict was read, Delphine collapsed in the arms of her son Thibaut. And that's because this is the other heartbreaking thing about this case, that within that 1 year, when Lola was killed, and by the time it actually went to trial, Lola's father Joan died of a heart attack. Now, of course, you and I understand heart attack, but I think more than anything else, we understand heartbreak, and that's what's, I would speculate, happened to Joan, who lost the light of his life, Lola. Delphine and Thibaut later described the ruling as a relief, not because it restores Lola back to life. Of course, it doesn't. But it closed the procedural chapter. And even when Thibaut and Delphine talk about Lola, and especially when they talk about the perpetrator, they do not take her name, they just call her the monster. And rightly so. So, this is a case with a lot of criminological anomaly. It's one of those cases where female perpetrated homicide goes against our understanding of how they and why they even happen. Mostly, we understand that women are pushed into killing someone after, let's say, an assault or sustained trauma. This is not one of those cases. It is very statistically rare for women to offend against a minor and to kill them in this way. The sexualized violence here committed by a woman against a strange child, a stranger, is extremely rare. Stranger abduction within a secured building is very, I mean, that's how it happened, because it was inside a secured building, so you wouldn't even think that your child is unsafe, and your child would think, oh, it must be a neighbor. So in a way, the audacity of Dabia was secured by this building where nobody can enter unless they have a swipe card. Now, one or two things which I should tell you. Now, this is all speculation, because as I said, that's the problem in this case, that one doesn't know the granular detail, the choreography of the crime, as it were. Interestingly, Dabia has said some really strange things, because she was, I think, trying to portray herself as a woman who'd lost her mind. As a matter of fact, if you see some of the videos she has made of herself over the years before she committed this crime, I think most of us will say this is a person who's not quite right here. She said, I did this crime because I got confused between Lola and her mom Delphine, and actually I wanted to do this crime against Delphine because Delphine once stopped me from entering the building. However, this, I mean, as you and I know, this is not an excuse. This, and basically, it's just one of those ramblings that Dabia has done over time. Okay, she's said all sorts of things. She's also been, there's also a lot of speculation in this case that this woman was really into a type of witchcraft. She thought that inside the child was a jinn, and the pronunciation is jinn. It's basically in Islamic faith. It's a kind of ghost. So that's something that's been brought up in this case as well. Nonetheless, if we go back to looking at this criminologically, sexualized violence committed by a woman against a child is still extremely rare, and all of these variables in this case actually sit all by themselves on the margins of an established pattern that we usually try to find in criminology. And that's what makes this case so strange, right? Because in criminology, we are always trying to predict the probability of a crime happening, and that's the only way in which as a society we can stop it from happening. And the fact that it's just so strange, how does one even stop something like this from happening? However, the good thing is that even though this is an anomaly of a case, it doesn't mean that the law cannot step in. The law clearly stepped in. Okay, these kind of cases can test the law, but the law at the end of the day wins. And France responded in this case, as you know, through institutional design. There was an investigative magistrate oversight the entire time. There was this mandatory psychiatric review of Daviet. There was this hybrid judicial system, the jury system, which deliberated on this whole thing. There was a structured sentencing. She was given 30 years in jail, and they call that a perpetual sentencing. The public received very limited evidentiary detail. This is very different from the way things happened, let's say, in Florida or in many parts of the US and the UK. Nonetheless, the French system does not convert every procedural artifact into a public spectacle. And the dignity of this victim and the dignity of a minor is meant for an outsider like us, all outsiders. It can feel a little opaque, the entire French system. However, for French people, it just reflects their legal philosophy that justice is rendered inside the court and not in a continuous media release or a media trial. The nation debated immigration enforcement. The nation debated state responsibility in this whole case. Why was Daviet not removed forcefully from the country? But inside the deliberation room, where there were those 9 individuals sat together, they weighed the evidence and they reached a decision that required a majority. At the end of the day, what we have in this case is the one fact which remains unchanged. A child entered her own apartment building at 3:25 p.m., but she never made it home. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for today. Okay, if you have any thoughts, any comments about this case, please let me know. And until I see you again, stay collectively vigilant.